The New Orlean class were a heavy cruiser design that represented the last American heavy cruiser class that was designed to fit the Washington Treaty limits, which regulated displacement to a maximum of 10,000 tons. However, the ships were not originally going to be called the New Orlean class, as what would become the first three ships were originally ordered as the third, fourth, and fifth ships of the Portland class. But the Portland class, like all other American heavy cruisers at the time, had the small problem of being armed with 8-inch guns, but lacking any armour capable of protecting any part of the ship against 8-inch shell fire at reasonable ranges. The new design dedicated nearly 3 times as much weight to armour compared to previous classes, and so the three ships were reordered to this improved layout. That wasn't the end of it, though. The lead ship of this particular batch was the USS Astoria, and so for a while the ships were called the Astoria class, although thanks to USS New Orleans being built in the New York Naval Dockyard, it was actually finished first. The class comprised 7 ships: the New Orleans, the Astoria, the Minneapolis, the Tuscaloosa, the San Francisco, the Quincy, and the Vincennes. An 8th vessel, the USS Wichita, was a subclass, essentially being a New Orleans-class cruiser fitted into a highly modified version of the hull of a Brooklyn-class light cruiser. Additionally, after the first 3 ships, each subsequent pair was built to a slightly different layout. The ships were physically slightly smaller than the earlier designs, which allowed the belt armour to be shorter and thicker, but within the treaty limits it was not possible to protect the ship against 8-inch fire except for the turrets and barbettes, a situation which would come back to haunt the class later. But overall protection against smaller shells was much improved. The range of the ships was somewhat less than the previous vessels to allow for this protection, although the top speed of about 33 knots was retained. The main battery consisted of 3 triple turrets with long 8-inch guns, a pair superfiring at the front and one at the rear. 8 single 5-inch guns and 8 50-caliber machine guns made up the combined secondary and anti-aircraft battery. This was somewhat light anti-aircraft firepower in a Second World War ship, and the need for more protection was quickly recognised. The standard American wartime policy of guns, guns, and even more guns everywhere was soon in effect. As an example, by the end of the war, the New Orleans herself had 24 40mm and 28 20mm cannon, and the other ships of the class carried similar upgrades. Due to the additional weight of these guns and things such as radar, the aircraft catapult and the aircraft themselves were removed just to keep the ships the right way up to prevent them from capsizing. The ships entered the Second World War somewhat unprepared, and this led almost directly to a disaster which caused the renaming of the class officially. In 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign was being fought, and one of the first engagements was the Battle of Savo Island. Despite the Allied force having 6 Treaty-era heavy cruisers, 2 modern light cruisers, and 15 destroyers, and facing a Japanese task force of 5 hilariously under-armed heavy and 2 light cruisers of wildly different ages and designs, plus a single destroyer which managed to get lost along the way, the Japanese exploited their superior night-fighting capability and a degree of arrogance on the part of the American commanders to utterly decimate the Allied fleet. 3 of the New Orleans class, the Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, were present, and all were sunk in the second part of the engagement by a mixture of shells and torpedoes. Immediately after this loss, the remaining 4 ships were pulled into harbour for extensive refits that changed the appearance of the ship significantly and added much of the additional anti-aircraft firepower mentioned earlier. After this, the ships were renamed the New Orleans class. Fortunately, the other 4 ships had very active service lives, the career of New Orleans being covered separately, but as for the other 3, Minneapolis took part in 3 major carrier battles and several major invasions, including the operations that led to the Battle of Surigao Strait, where she helped to sink the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. In the middle of all the excitement, she also took part in the latter half of the Guadalcanal campaign, which seems to have been a bit of a nemesis for the class, since she was hit by a pair of torpedoes and was only just saved. Later in the war, whilst helping the invasion of Okinawa, she wore out her guns firing at shore targets and spent a few days reduced to the status of floating anti-aircraft battery before heading home to get new guns. The San Francisco spent most of its time escorting and assisting with the various landings and assaults in the Pacific, although it also suffered from the curse of the class in the Guadalcanal campaign, almost being torpedoed by a submarine in one battle and accidentally shooting up the USS Atlanta, then almost being pounded to scrap by the Japanese battleship Kirishima and the cruiser Nagara in yet another battle. However, thanks to the short range of the engagement, most of the damage was to the superstructure and the ship was repaired for its later actions. The Tuscaloosa avoided this curse by sensibly spending almost the entire war in the European theatre of operations, escorting numerous convoys in the Atlantic and Arctic before helping in the landings in Africa as part of Operation Torch, dodging Vichy French torpedoes, and then having to restock on ammo at least once whilst giving good, accurate fire support. She would repeat this trick, including using up all her ammunition, at the D-Day, Oran, and Italy landings. She eventually showed up in the Pacific for the Iwo Jima landings and would prove the luckiest of the class, surviving Japanese, French, and German shells, torpedoes, bombs, and suicide aircraft in great quantities with barely a scratch. After bringing Allied troops home, along with a collective 64 battle stars, the class was rapidly taken out of service due to the many more modern heavy cruisers, such as the Baltimore class, that were then in service, and the significant overweight issues that had been caused by upgraded anti-aircraft batteries. The class remains somewhat unique due to battle damage taken by Minneapolis and New Orleans, requiring that the class have 2 more bow sections built than there were actually ships in the class, due to the need for replacements.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.